Yeah, so it turns out some cards from Scholomance Academy are pretty good, and in fact, seemingly way better than old Hearthstone cards. So I wanted to spotlight some of the cards here that have definitely surpassed the power level of past sets and seemingly do what they're trying to do much, much better than their former selves. Like, for instance, here, Voracious Reader is like 1,000 times better than Jeeves. And Jeeves was a card that used to get played. It was a great reload tool for aggro decks, face decks. They'd go all in, they'd draw Jeeves, they'd plop him down, they'd get 3 additional cards. That would be extra burst damage, another wave of small stuff to play, and hopefully that would be enough to keep their engine going and enable them to kill their opponent. And Voracious Reader does the exact same thing, but at half the cost, and it's non-symmetrical, because sometimes if you were in like a face versus face matchup and you played Jeeves, you'd actually reload your opponent's hand before you'd reload your own. So essentially, like, they'd get 2 extra cards or something they'd be able to play the turn you played Jeeves or the next ensuing turn and kind of punish your Jeeves almost, and it'd take you another turn to get those cards from Jeeves and actually put them into play. So it did have some backfires and downsides due to the symmetry. Voracious Reader doesn't have any symmetry. Your opponent doesn't benefit from it at all. So not only is it half as expensive, but there's no real downside either, which is pretty nuts. So it's more flexible to squeeze into a turn. You get the same upside, no risk exposure at all from Voracious Reader. It just makes it like the perfect tool for those really hyper-aggressive decks to get reloads in, and we're seeing it played in things like Aggro Demon Hunter. Face Hunter's gaining a ton of popularity and strength right now, in large part thanks to Voracious Reader. Like, sure, it doesn't have a mech tag, but who really cares at the end of the day, particularly in modern Hearthstone, when the real goal for this card is the reload, and it does it so much better. So next up here, let's take a look at Self-Sharpening Sword compared to Poison Blade. This one's kind of bonkers how different these cards are. And of course, this is across, like 5 years or something from Grand Tournament to now, but still it really showcases the difference. And I think Poison Blade, widely considered one of the worst cards ever. So don't read too much in this video about like power creep. That's not a term I'm going to be using here. I'm just calling out cards that are way stronger. I'm not making some sort of meta statement about power creep and whether it's bad or good for the game. You're welcome to discuss that in the comments. There are probably some great data points here to utilize for said arguments. I'm not going to get into that too much. I just want to showcase the differences between the cards. Particularly Self-Sharpening Sword, it's 10 damage bundled into it all by itself. It doesn't need any buffs or anything. It's 4 + 3 + 2 + 1. That's a lot of output for a 3-mana card. Now, on the other hand, Poison Blade, if you want to get to that stage, it's going to take more than 2 hero powers. 2 puts it at 3/3. That's still not even 10 damage. So it's kind of like 2.5 hero powers or 5 additional mana commitment to get Poison Blade to the same level as a base Self-Sharpening Sword. That's a 9-mana card versus a 3-mana card for the same total damage output. Now, theoretically, Poison Blade could scale even harder. You could push this up to 10 damage with your hero power, but it would take you 10 turns and 20 mana. It just does not scale very favorably at all. You have to commit mana. It's hard to do that. Self-Sharpening Sword, you just go. It works on its own. It does its own thing, and it starts out even better at a base level as well. So right off the bat, like that first turn, you've got more to work with here from durability standpoint and an equal attack value as well. So I mean, just in every conceivable way, Self-Sharpening Sword is just demonstrably better than Poison Blade. All right, so next up here is Lord Bearoff compared to Equality. You've essentially got a cheaper card, minion, so it's got stats on board, and it's got this death rattle upside, so that it can theoretically deal with the entire board by itself, whereas Equality, usually you have to combine it with something. Now, that's often true with Lord Bearoff as well. Bearoff has one small downside, which is that you can't play him with Wild Pyromancer like you can Equality for that immediate 1/2 punch. You'd have to have another spell for Pyro if you're playing Lord Bearoff. But in cases of Consecration or any kind of whirlwind effect, clearly Bearoff does more, and you've got this upside on the minion, and it's cheaper as well. So, in 90% of ways, Bearoff is just directly superior to Equality and preferable for most decks, I'm sure, to run as well. Plus, of course, Warrior has access to him. So plenty of upsides here. And I also thought about comparing Lord Bearoff to things like Unstable Ghoul, where it's like just the death rattle alone is comparable to some past Hearthstone minions. He also looks better in that direction in a lot of ways, if you consider his death rattle effect too. So perhaps even from multiple angles of attack here, Bearoff appears to be a stronger card than many of his past peers, which again, that's probably okay. He's a legendary. I'm not making value statements here about whether that's right or wrong, just describing what's happening, and certainly Bearoff appears to be much, much better. All right, so next up here, we've got the Twilight Runner. And this card's clearly made a big impact in Hearthstone here early in Scholomance Academy with Guardian Animals. It turns out having stealth and card draw bundled with it is pretty insane, especially if you give it rush, you get some immediate card draw. Sometimes that stealth lingers around. It's almost always drawing cards. I've very rarely seen this thing killed when it hasn't drawn cards, maybe 1 in 10 times. And compared to some of the past 5 mana beasts we've seen both in Druid, but also in the neutral set, Twilight Runner just works way, way better. Stranglethorn Tiger, of course, is beaten here because of this insane card draw upside. And Verdant Longneck, right? Even in Druid, he sometimes adapts with stealth. And then he's just exactly the same as Twilight Runner, but with no card draw. Now, clearly Adapt has like flexibility upside, so you can't argue Twilight Runner is explicitly better, but I think we can all agree most of the time, 99% of the time, Twilight Runner is just way more consistent, way more upside than really any of the adapt options for Verdant Longneck. So clearly a much, much better beast here at the 5 mana slot, whether you go for the kind of Druid angle or the stealth angle. This card just does it so much stronger than past options we've seen and is perfect for that Guardian Animals Druid. So speaking of Guardian Animals, let's just talk about it. 7 mana spell, of course, getting 2 beasts from your deck and giving them rush. Now they have to cost less than 5. As we've seen though, that's not much of a problem. It turns out there's some pretty awesome 5 mana beasts added right alongside Guardian Animals. And what that means is this card basically draws cards from your deck, cheats them out from a mana standpoint because you're spending 7 to get 10 mana worth of minions, and then you're also giving them rush, which is also a premium effect as well. So the things you're doing for Guardian Animals, there's a lot bundled into this card, right? It's draw 2, it's play 10 mana worth, and giving them rush, which is worth, a mana or 2 on top of that, I'd say. So all in all, just ridiculous output here for Guardian Animals, particularly when this is played for free half the time with Kael'thas. Now, compare that to something like Stampeding Roar from the past here, right? That was a 6 mana Druid spell. It summoned a random beast from your hand and gave it rush. So similar idea, summon a beast into play, give it rush. Now, the difference is, of course, 6 mana versus 7 mana, but you only got 1 beast and you didn't draw it from your deck. It already had to be in your hand, so there was no resource advantage from Stampeding Roar, right? It was only a tempo advantage. And the idea here is that you could maybe cheat out like, a 10 mana beast. And that would really help because you'd save 4 mana, you'd give it rush, make it even better. The thing is, Guardian Animals also summons 10 mana worth of beasts. So that's no upside on Stampeding Roar, and it draws those beasts, so you don't lose any resources in the process. So Stampeding Roar, you lose the roar itself and the minion from your hand. Guardian Animals pulls them out of your deck, so you don't have to draw them. So it's just way stronger for only 1 mana. It's kind of obscene how different these cards are from a power level standpoint. And of course, Stampeding Roar, we never saw that getting played. Guardian Animals is absolutely everywhere. I also wanted to draw one other comparison here. This is certainly more of a sideways comparison, but just to compare it to other recruit style effects, right, with a cost limitation. We had Guild Recruiter in the past that would recruit a minion that costs 4 or less. Now, that was actually an okay card. It wasn't great, but I think it popped into a deck here or there and was fine in like Arena and stuff sometimes. But it had a really tight deck restriction because if you ran like 1-drops or 2-drops, you'd recruit something totally garbage. So it didn't work. But because Guardian Animals is actually more specific and it only pulls beasts, then the deck restriction's not a problem. You just run the exact 5 mana beast that you want and you're good to go. You can run anything else you need, low cost minions as needed in your deck, no problem. So Guild Recruiter pulled less minions, didn't give them rush, and you got a nice little 2/4 bonus body here, but for only 2 extra mana, it's kind of crazy how much stronger Guardian Animals is from a recruit style effect as well. So any way you break this down, Guardian Animals it has like 10 times the power level of these past cards. It's just doing it so much better. So next up here, let's take a look at Commencement, another recruit style effect here for Paladin and Warrior, of course, being used in things like Big Warrior to cheat out some big minions, some Rattlegores, and some Troublemakers and stuff, and some Deathwings occasionally, etc. And you give it Taunt and Divine Shield, so it becomes this huge defensive body, which is amazing. Now compare that to Gather Your Party from Kobolds and Catacombs. For for 1 mana less here, you don't get Taunt and Divine Shield. And I think we can all agree Taunt and Divine Shield is worth way more for only 1 mana. And they work otherwise exactly the same. They're both recruit style effects. In both cases, you want to run bigger minions, right? But Commencement, it gives you the reliability of making it a defensive body guaranteed. Whereas with Gather Your Party, like if you're worried about dying or taking a hit, you just can't afford to play it unless your deck is only running Taunt. So it's either a big deck restriction or a risk to play. With Commencement, it doesn't matter. You can still slam a Commencement, no problem, and you know that you're going to have that defensive body on board that might be reliant to beat aggro decks and such. So for only 1 mana, I think that's an enormous upside. Like Divine Shield and Taunt are amazing for 1 mana. Now, this may not be quite as decisively different as some of the past cards we've seen, but I can't underestimate how important that is for a big style deck. Now, on the other side of things, we've got a new challenger, an old card for Paladin you may have forgotten about. In that case, you got the Taunt and Divine Shield for 7 mana, but it wasn't a minion from your deck. It was only a 6-cost minion that you discovered, which means on average, you're just getting a way worse minion. You're getting a Boulder Fist Ogre instead of a Troublemaker, right? It's just suddenly Troublemaker has way more upside. You're getting the 12-12, you're getting the Rattlegore, etc. So, I mean, of course, new Challenger's more flexible in that way. Like, you don't have to play it in only a big deck or something, but you don't get the crazy upside and swing potential that Commencement offers when you do construct your deck in the correct way. So this is a great example of a card that's not like, strictly power creeping or anything. There are arguments that it's worse in some ways, but it's just subjectively so much obviously better for the kinds of decks that want to run these. It has way, way more upside than either of these past cards that did similar sorts of things. All right, next up here, we got the animated Broomstick versus Skaterbot. And this one took me a little bit to figure this one out. And by the way, there are a ton of cards that aren't on this video that probably satisfy the same discussion. So I'm curious to hear other ones you can think of in the comments below. But for animated Broomstick versus Skaterbot, they both basically are the same thing. 1 mana, 1/1 that's giving something rush, or alternatively has rush itself, right? You can just play the Skaterbot on its own, or you can magnetize it for a single minion to gain rush. Now, the Broomstick, though, your entire board gets rush instead of just a single minion, and you're not limited to mechs like you would be with the Skaterbot. And you might say, well, you can use Skaterbot as like a buff to your minion as well to help it take better trades. But remember, the Broomstick itself can also trade in as a 1/1, which could be even better in some cases to say like pop a Divine Shield and then still give the other thing rush. Whereas the Skaterbot, you have to magnetize it to give rush to the big thing. So if there's a Divine Shield in the way, you're just stuck trading into the Divine Shield. So yeah, of course you could use Skaterbot for 1 extra face damage on occasion that the Broomstick can't do. So, again, not strictly better, but in like 98% of scenarios, animated Broomstick absolutely destroys Skaterbot, particularly when you're not dealing with only mechs. So this card just has way more output. Theoretically, 6 times as many minions, because it could be 6 additional minions on board instead of 1 additional minion on board getting rush. And we've seen this currently in like Survival of the Fittest Druid. We have all these crazy stats on board because of Survival of the Fittest. This thing becomes big itself, and you can suddenly start trading in your entire board, which is pretty ridiculous and just so much stronger than Skaterbot. All right, next up here, we've got Gift of Luminance versus Vivid Nightmare. Vivid Nightmare was a card that actually got played as well in some things like Combo Priest, copying extra Velens and such. Turns out getting a copy of a minion for 3 mana is often very efficient. Even if it has low health, you don't care because you're like doing something cool with it or ending the game. Gift of Luminance offers the exact same upside for copying a minion. So if you wanted to do the same thing with a Velen combo, you could with Gift of Luminance. You're going to get the extra minion on board, but you're getting also Divine Shield on the first minion. So it's getting a ton of stickiness or able to take trades or just a nice buff. And then your copy's also getting Divine Shield, so it's extra sticky as well. So the same sort of base utility exists as a weird combo enabler or whatever, but you've also got this giant upside as a tempo card where it's good just to play on board, making stuff sticky, utilizing it as a buff combo. Now, obviously, the 1/1 is a 1/1 Vivid Nightmare. You could say, well, I got a 10/1 out of it. That's way more attack, Regis. But of course, when it's attached to 1 health, that extra attack often isn't worth much outside of some scenarios where it's exactly rush. So again, not strictly better, but in almost every scenario that matters, Gift of Luminance just does what Vivid Nightmare does. And it does a lot of extra things as well, making it a much more flexible option. All right, next up here, we've got Lightning Bloom over Innervate and, in fact, Counterfeit Coin, which I thought I'd include because it's exactly the same as Innervate. And, of course, Lightning Bloom kind of doing what old Innervate did before it got nerfed. It used to just give you 2 mana crystals, which is just mind-boggling today because Innervate's still a really good card. I can't even believe that existed. But we're going back to it with Lightning Bloom, just with a little bit of overload there, tossed on to theoretically punish your big accelerated mana. But as we've seen, that overload ends up really not mattering much because it's the turn that you play Lightning Bloom that you're often decisively swinging and often even really decisively winning the game because you're making such an enormous turn that turn that it doesn't really matter what happens next turn, and 2 overloads not punishing enough that you can't still do things to follow up as well. So this ends up in many cases looking exactly like an old Innervate, enabling crazy Kael'thas turns and accelerated ramp and all kinds of absurdities. So it just feels like an old Innervate. Most of the time, an old Innervate was completely insane, and it feels much, much better than standard Innervate right now in many scenarios as well. Just giving you that extra mana can go a long way to squeeze in whatever other extra spell you need, the crystal power for Kael'thas, etc. So a pretty boring one to talk about because it's kind of been hammered on a ton, just how crazy Lightning Bloom feels in many cases. But because the overload is so insignificant most of the time, it does feel enormously more powerful than these other options we've seen. So next up here is Mindrender Ellucia. This one's a bit of a sideways comparison, but I thought it was important to talk about nonetheless. Of course, she's swapping hands with your opponent, so they get your hand, you get theirs. It's a bit reminiscent of what Azalina Soul Thief used to do back in the day, where you would copy your opponent's hand, so sometimes you could like steal their combo, or if you were an aggro deck out of gas, you could use their hand to reload, so you went from like 0 cards to 8 cards in hand all of a sudden. So shenanigans were possible, but of course it came at a huge premium of 7 mana for the Azalina, and you'd only get a 3/3. So you paid a huge price for that, and it was a slower game plan. And Lucia, sometimes you can do the exact same thing where you're out of gas and you copy your opponent's hand, but it only costs you 2 mana, so there's still a ton of stuff that you can do. You have so much mana left over, you can start playing things from their hand. And then on top of all that, you actually stole their hand. So if you play the cards, if you use their resources, they're gone. With Azalina, you just copy it. So they still got to play with their stuff. With Ellucia, you take it, you steal it, it's gone. So it's straight up ripped out of their hands. And clearly that just makes it a crazy turn for, you know, if that in that empty hand scenario, it's like a bajillion times better than Azalina. And of course, there are other implications as well. Instead of copying your opponent's combo, suddenly you can ruin it. You can toss out their Malygos or their mana cheats or whatever it is Ellucia played and rips it out from another hand. And then on top of that, Ellucia is like actually sometimes just a good like early game play. You can just play this on 2 sometimes and like take your opponent's coin, leave them with a hand where they can't play anything, so they kind of pass their 2 or 3 mana turn. And you've just disrupted everything. They can't really do anything in the early game. You got a 1/3 body on board, and you're rolling against an aggro deck because you played a tempo Ellucia. So there's like 3 different directions where Ellucia is just strictly better than a card like Azalina because she can do so much more, and she's only 2 mana along the way. So it's kind of crazy when you look at like disruption or borrow or copy style effects like this, how much more efficient Ellucia is than anything we've seen in the past. She's really crazy powerful. And this example, I think, is just one of many that showcases just how absurdly strong she is. And that's it. I think we're done. I think that's all the cards here. Again, this was really a small subset. I'm sure if I went into more thought, I could find 10 more examples of cards from Scholomance that have some way or another eclipsed cards of old. That said, I'm curious what you guys have to say. Like, which cards do you think stand out the most? Which of these are a problem? Which are okay? You know, talk about power creep and its implications all you want in the comments below. Whether that's strict power creep or subjective power creep, there's a big argument there every single time. Regis, Stranglethorn Tiger is a neutral card. It's okay if Twilight Runner is better. I totally agree. That's not what this video is about. So talk about that in the comments below if you'd like. and I'll join in and certainly enjoy that discussion as well. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. Thanks much as always for clicking the video and watching the dude talk about the Hearthstone. So thanks much, and until next time, game on.